All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. We are continuing this morning in Meretz Hashem and Osnun Beis in Tzidkas Hatzaddik. So the Rebbe, let's just pick up where we left off. We left off on page Kuf Chav Gimel, Osnun Beis, page Kuf Chav Gimel, Be'uri HaChasidus, the left-hand column in the bottom. So this is actually quite beautiful. So the Rebbe writes as follows: V'hinei davar muchach. So remember again, Reb Tzaddik was developing a theme which is not novel, because we've learned this concept before, but you're going to see that what Reb Tzaddik is going to do with it today, I think, is actually quite novel. So Reb Tzaddik spoke about the idea about messianic redemption, and Mashiach could come either to a generation that is deserving or to a generation that's kulo chayiv, that's undeserving. But the incredible thing is that the generation that's undeserving often could be transformed into a deserving one through the process of tshuva, as we'll discuss. And Reb Tzaddik really highlighting the idea. Well, actually, let's see. So remember, actually, we left off. I think page Kuf Chav Daled. Excuse me. So let's pick up page Kuf Chav Daled. So the Rebbe says, "V'hari Amru Chazal, Eizu dar chaviv mikol hadoros." This is actually a very beautiful idea. In the eyes of the Ribono Shel Olam, what is considered to be like the most, when the Ribono Shel Olam looks at the generations, which generation is considered to be the most beloved of all the generations? So the Rebbe says, quoting over here the Yerushalmi, Eizo dar chaviv mikol hadoros, ze dor Hamidbar, generation of the desert, which is really quite interesting. Think about this, and the timing of this is quite amazing. Parshas Kisisa this week, Chita Egel this week, one of the worst averos committed in the history of the Jewish people was, if you think about the top two averos committed by the Jewish people, Chita Egel, what else? Right, Chita Meraglim, committed by the same generation. But now, again, I also want to be clear, in general in life, you never stand in judgment of someone else. Judging other people is never really a beneficial exercise, especially given the fact that we truly never understand the circumstances. We don't understand what it means to live under 210 years of servitude and then suddenly be emancipated. We recognize that there's a residual impact on being a slave for so many generations. So chas v'shalom, no level of judgment. But nevertheless, it's fascinating to see a statement like this, that the most beloved generation in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Dar Hamidbar, the generation that still objectively committed so many two major dramatic averos. So the Rebbe says, Batan lema'alasamzu, Shadar Hamidbarhum, mipnei shezachu lekabalas haTorah. So I will say, but on the other hand, as much as Dor HaMidbar committed the Cheta Egel, Cheta Meraglim, they also were the generation who experienced Kabbalah Satorah. Kabbalah Satorah, Sinaitic revelation, acceptance of the Torah. The Gamla Acher Madrigasim Hanemucha Bagalos Mitzrayim, his Alu Lihios Hadar Hachaviv Biyosem Mikol Adoros. See, Reb Tzaddik says something absolutely amazing. What does it mean when the Yerushalmi says that the most beloved generation in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the Dar HaMidbar? Because Reb Tzaddik posits that if you look at the generation, the Dar HaMidbar, perhaps there's been no other generation who has undergone such dramatic transformative change as the Dar HaMidbar. It's possible that's what Chazal is saying, that's what Reb Tzaddik is trying to bring out. Think about this. It's true, they committed some significant averos, but where else did you ever find a generation who could go from slaves to Naaseh v'nishma in 49 days? Where else did you ever see an entire generation who could undergo such cathartic, transformative change within such a relatively short amount of time? And the Rebbe says, in the eyes of HaKadosh, and this is the thing that the Reb Tzaddik is going to highlight over here. Number one is the power of change, or the ability to change. Number two, how in the eyes of the Ribono Shel Olam, when we exercise that ability to change, that is the most beloved thing in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kimokein, ala doro shel Shlomo HaMelech alav hashalom. Let's actually, if you skip a little bit, skip to the bottom on page Kuf Chav Daled in the Be'orei HaChasidus. Skip to the bottom of the right-hand column. V'zeh mipnei she'efshar. So here's the question. So Reb Tzaddik now asks on a different level, and I think that this is a question that many of us that we ask ourselves many times when we learn the stories of the Dor Hamidbar. How could this be? How can you have a generation? How can you have a generation who could exhibit the worst kind of behavior? The worst kind of behavior, right? So they could go ahead and they could build the ego. They can go ahead and commit the Chita Marak. I will say, by the way, those are just the two major ones, right? Remember, again, there's a lot of other small stuff which unfolds over the course of the 40 years in the desert. How could it be that you could have the same generation engage in all of this negative activity and yet also say Naaseh v'nishma? How does that, it almost appears to be an inherent personalistic contradiction, to which the Rebbe says something amazing. V'zeh mipnei she'efshar she'yihya hadar hahu mikodem kulo chayiv ula'achar mikan lifnei agula yishapchu osam anei hadar v'yisalu achiyo dar shuchav yoser. So again, Reb Tzaddik brings in the Dor of Shlomo Melech, which I want to leave out for today. But Reb Tzaddik says, in general, how could it be that you could have a generation that essentially is what he calls kulo chayiv? Kulo chayiv. In other words, committing the worst kind of activity, and yet again could then in the next moment raise themselves up to the pinnacle of holiness and spiritual accomplishment. So the Rebbe says something so beautiful. Al yidei masha Hashem yisbarach yivi'im l'tshuva b'chol derech shehi v'al karcha chavivos yisera zu himipnei sheshoresh nishmasam humimakom gavoa yosem mikol hadoros. So the Rebbe says, because you have to understand something, that the neshama of a Jew comes from a place that is gavoa yoser. That wording is so profound. The neshama comes from a place that is gavoa yoser. Gavoa yoser, not just high, but more high. The highest of the high. If you skip down a few lines, de be'emes kol chatoi Yisrael einam be'etzem. I will say this is perhaps one of the most important lines in Kol Torah Kula, because this is the he says the be'emes, because in reality, kol chatoi Yisrael einam be'etzem. But we'll say when a Jew sins, it's not be'etzem. When I sin, it's not in my essence. That's not my essence. When I sin, I'm making a dramatic mistake. I'm abusing my koach habechira, my power of free choice. And when I sin, ultimately, again, I'm making a poor decision. But that sin does not reflect who I am in my essence. Rak, listen to this. Rak nafshos Yisrael lechateim himshilon abasenu. So he quotes a very beautiful Gemara in Sanhedrin that when a Jew sins, what is this comparable to? La'asa dekoi b'nei chilfi. So he says it is comparable to a hadas, a myrtle branch that is growing amongst asavim roim, bad grass, I don't know, weeds. It's like a myrtle branch that is growing amongst weeds. Kolomar, shepnimius nafsham, nisheres pikdushasam, v'achatoim mastirim umechasim osum rak mibachutz, ve'inam pogmim es pinimiusam. So we'll say, Reb Tzaddik over here is discussing the very essence of the Jew. How is it that one generation could engage in such deleterious activity, such terrible chatoim, egel, meraglim, and a lot of other stuff, but you'd also say Naaseh Nishma? How does that happen? We'll say it's the same. By the way, remember how Tzaddik went back. How is it that a generation can be so bad, and yet HaKadosh Baruch Hu could bring about circumstances, and they do tshuva, and could transform themselves into the generation that's right to be Makabel Pnei Mashiach? How does that happen? Tzaddik says, because you need to understand the essence of the dynamic of the Jew. The essence of the dynamic of the Jew is, number one, Shoresh Nishmasam Mimakam Gavoa. Remember that phrase. Shoresh Nishmasam Mimakam Gavoa. The essence of my soul is from the highest of the high. I come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I am a Nitzutz Elokim Mima'amam, like the Balatanya writes. I am a spark from the Ribono Shel Olam. That's what I am. And that is my essence. But I sin. But I do things wrong. That's true. But those sins, those Averis, as Reb Tzaddik says, they are Einam Be'etzem. They're Einam Be'etzem. They're not my essence. They're bad things I do. So Reb Tzaddik says, I am like the myrtle branch that grows amongst the weeds. There's a lot of weeds. Those weeds represent my bad decisions. Those weeds represent my wrong turns. those weeds represent all the negative things I do in life. And sometimes there's a lot of weeds, so many weeds that you can't even see the myrtle branch. But at the end of the day, the myrtle branch is always there. The chait never impacts my etzem, never impacts my essence. The Rebbe goes on, so he goes on, if you turn the page for just a moment, okay, so he says, Aval mizeh move on, shekarshe yagi ezman ha'azik, sheyisrifu ha'cholchim, shesvivos ha'nefesh ha'nemshals l'shoshana, az tishair ha'shoshana, hainu ha'nefesh, bishlei musa b'kdosha. So he uses the metaphor from Shir HaShirim as well. Kishoshana bein ha'cholchim, like a rose amongst the thorns. So we'll say, what does that mean, like a rose amongst the thorns? That statement is the ultimate essence of the Jew. A lot of times, I create a lot of thorns through my negative activities. But just because there's a lot of thorns doesn't negate the fact that there's a beautiful rose. That's my etzim pnimiuso, the essence of who I am. The hados that grows amongst the weeds. So I will say, why is this important? Because Hatzaddik is describing over here why change is possible. Right? I will say, why assume that change is possible? Well, why is that? Why not say that after you make certain bad decisions, you've locked yourself into a certain way, and that's who you are. That's what you are. You've gone down a particular derech. That's what it is. Mehech say that change is possible. Why do you assume that? To which the Rebbe says, because of all, I'm not going to repeat everything again, but because of everything he said, when I sin, it's eina be'etzem. Because when I sin, the one thing, I may change my behaviors, and I may change as a result of my bad decisions, certain realities in my life, but I never change who I am. I never change my panemius. The panemius remains, the rose remains, the hadas remains. And because those things remain, therefore by definition, change is always possible. That's how a Dor Hamidbar goes ahead and builds the ego, commits cheta meraglim, but at the same time also goes ahead and says Naaseh v'nishma. It's a stira mineu, it's an inherent contradiction. It is an inherent contradiction. But lamaisa, because the inner rose, because the inner hados is never tainted, never compromised, therefore change always remains possible. I also have to stop over here, but again, you could see the power of Reb Tzaddik's words. This entire yisod, this is the key to tshuva, this is the key to optimism in life. Because if you don't believe this, if you don't subscribe to this, then the truth is, life is very depressing. Because every day is filled with dramatic mistakes. And if you don't accept this ideology of Reb Tzaddik, which is not just Reb Tzaddik, an ideology of Yiddishkeit, then at the end of the day, I make mistakes, and essentially I've locked myself in to an ongoing downward spiral. But if I believe in the inner rose, if I believe in the inner hados, then change is always possible. All right, Tabaseh Shekayach.